Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are delighted to be with you wherever you are. And thank you all for setting aside time to be at this important webinar. On behalf of the USC US-China Institute, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Clayton Doobie. I direct the Institute, and I'm assisted by a terrific team of folks that put together all of these events. I'll give you their names towards the end. I want to thank also our speakers who are very busy individuals who have carved out time to be with us today. Representative Ted Leon, in fact, has just come from another obligation to be with us just this last few seconds. And so we are grateful to each of you for being a part of today's event. And we want to encourage you to participate. The Zoom screen at the bottom, it has a Q&A button. You can click on that button and pop up a little screen and type in questions for our speakers. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please identify that person and please be as concise as possible in your questions. In the discussion session at the end of today's program, I will draw on your questions for our speakers. So again, thank you all for being here. You should also turn on the chat window. Just click on that chat button and that will pop that up. You cannot post there, but that's one way that we have to share. And so, for example, we'll be sharing links to each of the speakers' websites as well as to important resources. Well, everyone knows why we're here. We're here towards recorded on camera, but much of it not. And we have statistics that demonstrate a big explosion in reported cases, but we also of law enforcement. In 2017, the last year of law enforcement agencies reported no hate crimes of any sort in their jurisdictions. Now, you and I know that that's highly unlikely. And so that speaks to the underreporting problem. This is not an abstract topic. People's lives, people's safety is literally at risk. And we know that the threat has risen. And so we're here today to reach out to those who have been attacked, either through language or physical violence, and to their family and friends, and to let those folks, as well as anyone who might feel anxious or vulnerable, you aren't alone. You aren't alone. Members of our community are concerned about your well-being and concerned about the bias that's driving this. We have to tell those who abuse others that this is just not acceptable. We will not, as a society, tolerate it. There is no excuse for it. But we have to do more than, offer empathy and outrage. We need to what? We need to explore this bias that yields the abuse. We need to go at the thinking that people of Asian ancestry aren't and can't be Americans, that they somehow don't belong. And we have to speak to this problem. We need to make sure that we reach out and that we include. We have to also ask why America's relationships with other places can spill over into how we treat each other, how issues that the United States may have with China are sometimes driving what's happening towards Asian Americans in our country. We have to get beyond diversity as a slogan, diversity as the name of an office. We have to embrace diversity as a strength. We have to make it real. A lot of organizations have been holding webinars, and many people, especially here in Southern California, gathered on the weekend for rallies to protest Asian American hate. Our gathering is going to be similar in some respects to those, but it's also going to be different. We begin today with one of California's great representatives, Congressman Ted Leon, who represents one of the Southern California districts in Congress. We also have a distinguished group of scholars from across the United States and across campus. We have two USC professors, Jane Jun from political science and Lon Kurashige from the history department. From the University of Colorado at Boulder, we have Jennifer Ho. And from Atlanta, from the Carter Center, we have Professor Yahweh Liu. All of them are going to be speaking with us today. When they finish, then we'll get to your questions, but you can submit those questions at any time. So please don't hesitate to start doing so from the very outset. Our first speaker is the distinguished Congressman Ted Leon. Each of you has read his capsule biography as part of the event announcement. So you know that he has served the United States and the American people in many different capacities. He's served the United States in an Air Force uniform. He's been a clerk for a federal judge. He's been an elected representative in Torrance here in Southern California. He's served in state government and represents his congressional district in Washington, D.C. He is a distinguished leader in many areas, and one of the most important ones is in battling climate change. But he is also an important leader with the Asian Pacific American Caucus. Congressman Leon, please get us started.
Thank you so much, Clay, for your leadership and that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank the USC U.S.-China Institute for putting on this important program. And I'm honored to be on with this distinguished panel. And as Clay has mentioned, there has been an unfortunate surge in hate crimes against Asian Americans. This, however, is not surprising. If you look at our nation's history, unfortunately, when America feels fear, at times it will scapegoat minorities. And so in the 1850s, we had the whole yellow peril hysteria that was then followed by one of the largest mass lynchings in US history against a number of Chinese immigrants. And then we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We then had the internment of over 120,000 Americans who happened to be of Japanese descent during World War II. And then in the 1980s, when America feared the rise of Japan, you had additional hate crimes committed, including against Vincent Chen, who was murdered because they thought he was taking away jobs. And then now with this pandemic, you have another surge in hate crimes and hate incidents against Asian Americans. Part of this happens because of something called the foreigner syndrome. When people look at me or other Asian Americans, sometimes their first thought is that we're not American, that we're not loyal to this country, that we're second-class citizens. And you see this play out in different aspects of life, as well as in very bad acts by our own government. So, for example, the entire reason for the Japanese internment was the inability of our government to separate people who unfortunately do not separate the actions of a foreign government, in this case, namely China, who did suppress the virus and mislead the world about the virus at the beginning, versus Americans who happen to be of Asian descent that have nothing to do with that. And it also shows that rhetoric does matter. Unfortunately, last year you had the former president of the United States use racist phrases like Kung Flu, and that simply added fuel to the fire. And there's been studies that show, in fact, there were increases in hate incidents against Asian Americans because of the language that was used by the former president. And it is, again, this inability for our government and some people in America to make this separation between foreign governments and Americans of Asian descent that causes part of this problem. You also see it, for example, at the State Department. If you look at this issue known as assignment restrictions, what you'll see is that a disproportionate number of people who get assignment restrictions, in which they can't work in certain countries, happen to be Asian Americans. And it does appear to me, at least, that if you're an Asian American in sensitive positions in our government, that you're held to a higher standard, that somehow you're viewed with more suspicion, that somehow you might have dual loyalties. Other ethnic groups have encountered this as well. Jewish Americans, for example, I've also been the victim of this view of possible dual loyalties. And it's simply an issue that we have to speak up and speak out and fight against, and also to just educate government officials and policymakers that this is an issue and we need to fight back against it. Something else we need to do in terms of hate crimes specifically is one reason that you don't see the federal hate crimes law being used as often as it should be is because the courts have interpreted it really narrowly. The Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, for example, basically said that you can only charge federal hate crimes law if the sole reason. That's a pretty high bar to meet. And so I'm working on legislation that would change that and make it easier to charge a hate crime. And then we have to devote additional resources to investigations and prosecutions of hate crimes, as well as encourage people to report hate incidents as well. So thank you again for having me on this panel. Look forward to answering any questions that you may have, and really appreciate your focus on this important issue.
Congressman Leo, thank you for that opening presentation that really gets at some key issues, including this discrimination within the government at the State Department in terms of not making some positions available to people who are quite qualified for them and might represent the country quite well. So thank you for that. We're going now to move to Professor Jennifer Ho. And after all of the speakers have had a moment, in the spotlight, as it were, to share their thoughts, we will then have a discussion involving all of them. So please, a couple people have already posted questions. Please continue to do that. Professor Ho is the current president of the Asian American Studies Association. She's a distinguished scholar. She's produced a number of monographs and essential teaching collections. One of the things that I read that she wrote more than, I guess, a dozen years ago was when she was a relatively new professor at the University of North Carolina, writing about being an Asian American in the South and talking about that sort of experience. You've probably heard her on NPR. You may have read her essay, her recent essay on CNN, but I would also encourage you to go to the PBS website and to watch the film First Vote. She is one of the people featured in that film, which looks at engaging in North Carolina. Jennifer, take it away.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement because I'm coming to you from Lafayette, Colorado, which is the traditional territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. And I begin with a land acknowledgement because I think if we are going to talk about power structures, and we should be talking about power structures if we're talking about the rise of anti-Asian racism, then we have to acknowledge the complexities of race and racism in the United States, and to understand that the foundations of the United States are settler colonialism. So that means that even if I, as an Asian American, Chinese American, daughter of a refugee father from China, immigrant mother from Jamaica, whose parents themselves were immigrants from Hong Kong, right? We may not have been responsible for the US conquest of these lands, and yet I benefit from that settler colonialism. And I think it's important that we acknowledge our history. And so this is part of US history, just as the exploitation of Asians in America is part of US history. And so to understand the rise of anti-Asian racism happening now, we have to understand that the roots of that are white supremacy, which began against Asian, specifically Chinese immigrants in the 19th century. We also have to acknowledge the way that race and racism plays out among various non-white people in the United States. It is day 4 of the Derek Chauvin trial, where he has been accused of killing George Floyd. Now, I think that many people who saw those 8 minutes of footage would have no doubt that Derek Chauvin played a hand in George Floyd's death. What is also complicating everything is the ways in which Black Americans in this country are not given automatic humanity. That's one of the reasons that there's a movement called Black Lives Matter. Because so often throughout US history, Black Americans have not been given automatic humanity. And I want to talk about Black Americans, especially now, because there have been viral videos that have been occurring over the last few months showing Black people harming and in some cases killing Asians, especially Asian elders. And so when I do workshops and answer questions by the media, one of the things that comes up time and again is this question of the majority of these hate crimes happening at the hands of Black Americans. And what I continue to tell people is that that's simply not true. It is not true that Black Americans are perpetrating the majority of the racist incidents against Asians. There's a report that's soon coming out of University of Michigan. They're working with AAPI Hate. They were interviewed by NPR's Code Switch. And based on very rough data that they went through, looking through media reports, looking through people who turned in incidents reports to the AAPI Hate Data website, what they discovered is that roughly 90% of the anti-Asian racism incidents are happening by white people against Asians, and only 5% are by Black people against Asians. And I really think this is important. It's important for us to disrupt the narrative of Black aggression, particularly Black male brutality, because that's already a pervasive and damaging stereotype that is out there. There is a reason why the viral videos of Black people harming Asians has gotten much more traction than videos and images of white people harming Asians, when white people harming Asians has been happening since Asians first arrived in the United States. So the idea that Asian Americans are being targeted during COVID-19 is absolutely true. 150% spike in anti-Asian racism. But the concept of Asians being harmed is not new. It has been around since the 19th century, and we can see it in all the instances that Representative Liu just shared with us. I'm going to share some resources in the chat. I also want to address one of the questions that's already come up, which is thinking beyond the carceral in terms of how to address this rise of anti-Asian violence. So there's been a lot of discussion about whether what happened in Atlanta was a hate crime, and lots of discussions about trying to bring that shooter to justice. What seems clear to me, whether or not he's actually tried as harming specifically Asians, right, is that he, in his own words, targeted women. And we should really think about that. We should think about the fact that why isn't it being charged as a hate crime against women? I clearly believe that he targeted these women because they were Asian. I don't know whether I need him to be prosecuted and incarcerated for a hate crime in order for me to feel like justice is done. I think the concept of justice, for me, is going to be an end to racism in the United States, an end to white supremacy, an end to intersectional oppression. And the way that I know how to get us there is through education. Thank you.
Professor Ho, thank you so much for that presentation. And thanks too for posting useful links, useful resources in the chat space. The chat space has already got some materials there. Take advantage of those and be sure to save those and take and utilize them. Our next speaker is Professor Lon Kurashige, who is from the University of Southern California, has done extensive research on Asian American history. One of Professor Kurashige's great books is called Two Faces of Exclusion. And it's a wonderful book. I would encourage you to read it because it talks about exclusion as obviously an expression of bias, imposing legal discrimination, all of those sorts of things. But one of the important parts of that book is talking about the pushback on the part of Asians in America against such discrimination, but also the pushback by other Americans. It was always more complicated than we sometimes think. He's done work on the 1920 election, anti-immigration legislation in California, that sort of thing. Take advantage of that book. He's also the co-editor of a couple valuable teaching collections, Understanding Major Problems in Asian American History, and a new textbook called Global Americans, looking at where Americans are from, what they've contributed, and where Americans have gone. It's a terrific resource. Professor Kurashige couldn't actually be here with us today because he's in another web space teaching his class. So we recorded this presentation for you now.
Thank you, Clay, and for having me here today and for offering a historical perspective on the unprecedented events going on today about, or these days, of anti-Asian hatred and hate crimes and violence and so forth. The obvious historical perspective is this isn't new, right? And I think you don't have to be a historian to know this, although that's a whole nother question out there because so many people think this is new. They think this has never happened before. And it's the same people who think that Asian Americans are somehow all immigrants who've just come to the country in the last 10, 20 years, 30 years. So there's a long history, right, of Asians in the United States, of Asian Americans, going back to at least the mid-19th century, if not earlier, with the mid-19th century arrival of migrations of Chinese immigrants to the West Coast, to Hawaii, et cetera. And that history has been continuous. Chinese, then Japanese, and Koreans, and South Asians, and then and then Filipinos as well. And then, after World War II, many, many other groups. And so you have the situation where there's a strong presence of Asian Americans, especially in places like Los Angeles, but all around the country, right? So the fact that there are Asian Americans is not new. And because Asians have been in this country for a long time, anti-Asian hate, unfortunately, has been in this country for a long time. And that shouldn't surprise anyone, given the sort of white supremacist and minority, whether it's Blacks or Native Americans or Latinos or whomever, violence and hatred and legislation, that has been more the norm than the exception throughout American history. So it really is, just like with the civil rights movement for African Americans, it's really only since the 60s, right, that you have the end of at least formal anti-Asian racism, in policy, in laws, in statutes, et cetera, and in executive orders, like the executive order that sent 120,000 Japanese Americans to concentration camps during World War II. So those types of policies are only fairly recently abolished. And so there's always been a relationship between the hate crimes that have been rampant. And I don't know if I have the time to go into a lot of them, but I'm sure your other guests can talk about them and you can read about them. Massacres of Chinese workers in the U.S., violence against Japanese after Pearl Harbor, and then even up more towards the present, where after 9/11, where you have, South Asians, you have Sikhs with turbans getting shot at and killed as vengeance for, the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, et cetera, right? So the idea of scapegoats, whether it's Jews during the Holocaust or African Americans and all of the kind of urban riots and in the urban North against Blacks. I mean, the idea of scapegoats for some broader international or social problem or fear, is not new. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that Asians have been the victims. But that's the curious thing for me, is like why people don't know about the history of Asians in the U.S. And so that's maybe the larger question about not just how anti-Asian hate crimes are not new, but how people don't know about the history of Asian Americans. And there's a popular stereotype and a very pernicious stereotype that the result or the consequence of that history is that they think Asians aren't Americans, right? Somehow that we don't have a history, that if you have a history, somehow that roots you more in this country. It gives you more legitimacy somehow in America. So that idea of being forever foreign and thus not being American, is perhaps the deeper problem underneath all of these hate crimes. Because there's always going to be, I don't want to, validate in any ways the hate crimes going on and all of the problems. But there's always going to be scapegoats. There's always going to be some off-balance, crazy people out there during times of stress. In this case, international stress, involving China, right? In which crazy people are going to act, right? So you're always going to have that kind of scapegoating. What's different today, and perhaps I think more hopeful, is that the government is not condoning this. The government is not, contributing to this in terms of anti-Asian policies or orders. Of course, with the exception being Trump. I don't want to say everything's perfect and there's no problems, but the hate crimes, that's a continuity that unfortunately is going to be there because of the nature of scapegoating and the nature of white supremacy and racism, which persists in this country.
Thank you, Professor Kurashige. It's both sad that this seems new to people. And that's a failure, of course, of our educational system, and something that the people who are speaking today are all part of trying to address. In some states, it's mandated to teach about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's mandated to teach about internment. But in many places, this is not part of the story. And the contributions that Asians in America have made over the long sweep of US history have also been downplayed, neglected entirely. So this is important. And our next speaker, Professor Jane Jun from the Department of Political Science at USC, she's done, in addition to her other work, she's done some work on the impact of civic education on the involvement, the mindset of young people. And so she has some ideas about that working. But her field of expertise is political participation. She's written a number of books on this subject, including a couple key ones for our discussion today: The Politics of Belonging, Race, Immigration, and Public Opinion, as well as another book on Asian American political participation. Professor Jun, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Clay. And thank you to everyone for attending. I'm going to be brief, and I'd like to just make 3 points. I'm sure you all didn't attend this to get lectured at by university professors, so therefore what I want to do is give you 3 things to think about, and hopefully that we can continue on with our discussion. And they do relate to political participation. And the reason that I'm talking about them is, as I've read through the questions, some of the questions in the chat, they're all great questions, and many of them are focused on how it is that we combat prejudice against Asian Americans. There are many ways to do that, but I want to focus for the moment on participation and the role that ordinary Americans, that's all of us, should be playing in this process. And so by that, I mean on-the-ground mechanisms of democracy, and that's voting and things beyond that. So I just want to raise 3 points for your consideration. The first is the state of Asian American political representation in the United States. So to some degree, when we think about representation, we think about how it is not only just as a function of the types of attitudes and issues that people represent, but also in what form, in what person, in what body is there. I think it's quite important to see the members of Congress. This includes Representative Liu, who was an impeachment manager most recently on the second impeachment of Donald Trump. But in addition to that, many of our other members of Congress, not only from California, this is including Ami Bera and Ro Khanna in the North, and then Judy Chu, my member of Congress, but also 2 women who are the only Asian Americans in the Senate, Tammy Duckworth and Mazie Hirono. So on the one hand, what we view now is an increasing visibility of Asian Americans on the national political scene. But at the same time, I want to emphasize that the proportion of members of Congress, and let's just talk about the federal Congress here, because I imagine some of you are coming to this from outside of California. There are only 2 senators, that's only 2%, and there are only 15 members of Congress who are Asian Americans, that's only 3%. The proportion of Asian Americans in the US population is double that, 2 or 3 times that. In other words, that there's almost 6% of the American population that's Asian American, and much more heavily so in states like California, Hawaii, Texas, Washington, et cetera. So the first thing I'd like us to think about, and maybe just roll this over in your head, like, what does it mean to be represented as an Asian American? It's not a question that has an actual answer to, but I think what's important about it is not only the visibility that these current members of Congress and other political leaders show for us, but it's also celebrities, athletes who are representing the Asian American experience and our perspectives on this issue. The second thing I want to raise is for us to think a little bit about Asian American political participation. And many times elected officials or scholars or really political commentators will say, well, Asian Americans are not really very interested or active in politics. I would like to say for the record, that is just simply not true. Asian Americans do lag other groups of Americans, so whites, African Americans in particular, in terms of turnout, registration to vote. But much of that is a function of, or the explanation for that, is the fact that Asian Americans are a relatively new population. As Professor Kurashige noted, Asian Americans have come to the United States really only after 1965. And more than 2/3 of adult Asian Americans in the United States today are naturalized citizens. So you have to imagine the amount of time it takes to become a naturalized citizen and then register to vote and then go on. So while there are some gaps between Asian Americans and other Americans in terms of their voter turnout, Asian Americans will eventually catch up, and will catch up quickly as a function not only of their importance in politics or to politics, but because, relatively speaking, high levels of education, which always drives, for every group, for every person, more participation and activism in politics. The last thing I'll say about that is democracy is not just about voting. It's about everything that all of us do, whether that's going to meetings, going to school board meetings, giving donations, working in community-based organizations. These are all activities that contribute to the health of American democracy. In the absence of that activity, we will become more sick than we already are. I think the last thing I want to note is about the role of parties, other institutions, community-based groups, organizations in mobilizing the Asian American community. Someone mentioned faith communities in the chat. I think this is very important for us to consider the ways in which, even when something terrible and events like that happened recently in Atlanta and others, they provide a terrible reason for us to be mobilized, but at the same time, they provide also a sounding board and a place to begin. I just want to end then by highlighting to your attention, if you are a Democrat, maybe you're not, but if you're a Democrat, you might have enjoyed the outcome of the race for the 2 Senate seats in Georgia. I would like you to note just how important Asian American voters were in turning out to support Democrats in that election, and in this case, bringing the Senate to 50-50.
And so that, of course, is a key demonstration of the power of mobilized people, the role that people can play in the political process. And that's something that we can continue to address. Also, one of the things that was highlighted here is the role of the naturalization process. Unlike people who are just happen to be born within the boundaries of the United States and its territories and become citizens that way, people who are naturalized citizens have to prove themselves, have to earn their way in. They have to study and demonstrate to the satisfaction of an immigration official that they know U.S. history. They know something about the Constitution, these sorts of things. Now, a couple of people have already highlighted education. That's come up as well in the Q&A section. We can talk a little bit more about that. Now, Congressman Ted Leon is an immigrant himself. As a child, he came from Taiwan to the United States. Our next speaker came as an adult from China to the United States. When he was a young man in China, the policy there towards the United States switched dramatically. He remembers hearing, speakers announcing Mao Zedong's statements about American imperialism and the need to combat it wherever you find it, that sort of thing. And then President Nixon was visiting. And before long, President Carter established diplomatic relations with China. Professor Yawei Liu now works for the Carter Center in Atlanta. He has lived between the two countries, and we're honored to have him with us today. He's a specialist in how Americans and Chinese see each other and the relationship between the two countries. Yawei, take it away.
Thanks, Clay, for the invitation. And I have four observations, some of which are already covered by the previous speakers. The first one is anti-Asian racism is deeply rooted in America. I think Congressman Liu talked about that very well. You know, the lynching of the Chinese in 1850s, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, then the Japanese internment in 1942, and then he also talked about the brutal murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. He also talked about President Trump, labeling COVID as Chinese virus. What was not referred to is the China initiative at the Justice Department. If we have all read the White House facts sheet on how the administration is going to address this rising hate and crime against Asian Americans. But one of the things, one of the government agency that President Biden is enabling to return justice, to Asian Americans has failed to mention this initiative with a huge racist undertone, which is the China initiative. Now, the second point I want to make, I think Congressman and others have also mentioned, that is economic and political circumstances escalate anti-Asian racism into open hatred and even violence. When Vincent Chin was brutally murdered, beaten to death with a baseball bat, he was perceived to be a Japanese American. American government and the media outlet, back in the 80s, blame the Japanese economic aggression against the U.S. It's the Japanese that caused unemployment, particularly in Detroit, the motor city. That's why Vincent Chin was beaten to death in such a brutal way. What's even worse is he was only given a 3-year suspended sentence, and then others, took him to the federal court, and he was tried and convicted on violating Vincent Chin's human rights, the Ebens, the murderer of Vincent. But even that conviction later on was overturned by a federal court. So today, China is playing the role that Japan used to play. China is the culprit. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration describes China as a huge threat to the national security of the United States, as well as the welfare of the American people. So in this context, ethnic Chinese become agents of the communist conglomerate, but at the same time, they're targets of hate, targets of increasing and growing violence against them. My third point, I think Jennifer Ho also referred to that, is Asian American AAPI community is really a mixed group. Some of them are labeled as a model minority, which is oftentimes used by the dominant race, to ridicule and even to suppress other minorities. The second point about this mixed group is oftentimes, as Jennifer said, violence target other to destroy minority unity. We're all working together to pursue justice and fairness and equality. Also, I think Asian Americans, and in my case, Chinese Americans, we have our own problem on issues of racism. We do stereotype other ethnic minorities. And Asian Americans also stereotype each other. I just want to give you a case, an example that happened today. Sari Kim, a Korean American who is running for a House seat in Texas, made the following remarks. I don't want Chinese Americans to be here at all. They steal our intellectual property. They give us coronavirus. They don't hold themselves accountable. Frankly, I'm quoting her, I can say that because I'm Korean American. And the audience, if you watch the YouTube video, the audience just laugh and they think that, that's a very accurate comment. That's a sad and unfortunate reflection of what is going on here, but also their divisions among Asian Americans. Finally, I want to talk about Tan Xiaojie. Her English name is Emily Tan, the massage parlor owner who came from Nanning, southwestern part of China. What I want to say is her life tells us two things. Number one, the fact that she came here, the fact that she was able to succeed in her business shows to all of us that the United States is still the most friendly and open country to immigrants. If you give immigrants in search of a better life, in search of freedom, a choice of which country they would like to go to, I think most of them probably prefer to come to the United States. And that's a fact. And as Clay mentioned, I came from China. I came here with $200. The fact that I'm able to be relatively successful working for former President Jimmy Carter, I'm very grateful to the opportunities given by this country, and this country continues to offer this kind of opportunities to all immigrants, including Asian Americans and particularly Chinese Americans. But what her life tells us second is, this is again a country filled with discrimination, hatred, and unnecessary violence. And she was brutally shot to death here at the place. She's a good mom, she's a good boss, she's a good neighbor, she's a good friend. And the way her life was cut short, 2 days short of her 50th birthday, shows that there's a long way to go to make this country better. And we are survivors, and as survivors, all Asian Americans, all colored people need to work together to make this place a better place, so that not only we can work as hard as Emily Tan, not only can we succeed in what we are doing, but also to live long enough to enjoy the success, and also to make this place better and safer for our children and children's children. So I want to end my initial remarks by quoting Gary Locke, former governor of Washington State and American ambassador to China. He made the following remarks at the rally on March the 20th, after the brutal killing of 8 people here in Atlanta on March the 16th. So this is what Gary Locke said. When someone says to us, "Go back to where you came from," I will respond loudly, "Except for the Indians, we're all immigrants. Whether you come from Europe on the Mayflower, or the slave ship from Africa, or from Asia to build railways. This place is my hometown, America." Thanks.
Professor Liu, thank you so much for remembering the sacrifices, the actual work that so many have given, and then to have their lives extinguished so brutally. And we have two people who are part of the panel today who live and work at the sites of recent mass killings. And we've had mass killings here in Southern California of late as well. I want to invite all of the speakers to come back, to turn your cameras on and to come back. And I would like to begin with one of the questions that has come up in the Q&A. And so members of the audience, please continue to submit your questions via the Q&A. But also it's where Congressman Leon began. It's where several other people, including Professor Leon, traveled with us in their comments. And that's this question of foreignness. What does it take to be an American? What does acceptance require? And we focus on this and then we move on from it so readily. And the question of belonging, the question of inclusion, where are we? What do we need to do? Let's begin with Congressman Leon.
That's a great question. I certainly think that having representation matters, and not just in government, but everywhere. So during this pandemic, for example, my wife and I did happen to watch a variety of different series on Netflix and Amazon Prime. So one of the series we liked was Designated Survivor. It was about government, but also it just happened that there was a kick-ass FBI agent who happened to be a female Asian American. And we like also the series Veep. And in there was a character who played a conservative Christian governor of a Midwestern state who happened to be Asian American. So I think if you have the American public see Asian Americans in different settings and different walks of life, including government, that makes it better for everyone, and that we're trying to fight for in the House of Representatives. We do actually meet with various media companies and encourage more diversity, not just for Asian Americans, but for all minorities. And then having government officials who look more like the people they represent also has a more resilient government. And my last point is, all of you may have seen that Senator Tammy Duckworth essentially said that, look, to Biden administration, you got to do a better job in terms of having a diverse slate of Asian Americans being nominated. And she threatened to not vote for any more nominees. And then that caused the White House to create an entire new position dealing with Asian American affairs. Now, is it possible an Irish American member of the Senate would have done that? It's certainly possible, but it didn't happen. It did take an Asian American senator to get royally pissed off. And so representation also results in different policy actions as well.
Yeah, and let me continue on that for just a second and maybe bring Jane in, Professor Jun in on it as well. Why is it so important to put people in these places? Congressman Leon, you mentioned representation in the media. That's something that we've focused a lot on at USC, both women, different ethnic groups, that sort of thing. But why is it so important to have someone who has the lived experience of being an Asian American in these positions of responsibility?
Well, I think that these are standard to the descriptive representation claims that in order to understand what it feels like to receive the scrutiny, the extra scrutiny as a person who differs from what many Americans would say a regular American is. So what does it mean to be a regular American or a regular kid? Basically means that you're a white person. And so when we think about what does it mean to be an American, I mean, political scientists have been asking people these questions for many years. Do you have to be white to be American? Do you have to be Christian to be a real American? Must you be born in the United States? And over time, the numbers of people, the numbers of Americans that agree with those characteristics, that you have to be white and Christian and born in the US, has decreased over time. But it remains the case that white Americans in particular are likely to say, large proportions of them, probably similar to about what the base in the Republican Party is at present, agree that you have to be white to be a true American. You have to be a Christian. You have to be born in the U.S. And so there remains a significant, if not majority, proportion of white Americans in particular who still think to Asian Americans are hyphenated Americans. Someone in the chat wrote, why can't we just teach about all of American history instead of calling it, Asian American history is American history. I think that's a point well taken. I also just want to respond to something that the representative said, which is really true. An Irish American wouldn't need to do that today, right? If Tammy Duckworth was Tammy O'Neill, she wouldn't have to do that. She wouldn't be there if this was 100 years ago, because 100 years ago, there weren't very many women, certainly not women in the Senate. But 100 years ago, there was anti-Irish discrimination in the United States. It may have been necessary 100 years ago, in the same way it might have been necessary for Mario Cuomo's ancestors were they in the United States. Today, we face a different issue. I think the distinction between categories of white, even if they were considered less than white, remain nevertheless phenotypically understood by ordinary people as being of the white race, whereas Asians have always been the forever foreigner. So as optimistic as I think we can be about changes over time, I think it's also pretty difficult, and as we've noted from the other panelists, to move away from the long-standing, very deep history of the racialization of American citizenship. It is embedded in the Constitution. It's embedded in our history. It's part of the DNA of this nation. It is precisely why we need to be active politically until it goes away, because it won't go away without us.
Yeah, time certainly is not a way to solve this problem. Action is required. And so, most of the people in Congressman Leo's district are not themselves of Asian ancestry, but he is their representative. My representative is an African-American woman. And so they are all Americans and they can represent us in this way. And so getting beyond the idea that a regular American is a white male like me is, we have polls that suggest 2/3 of people of Asian ancestry have been asked, where are you from? Have been asked questions. Half of them have been asked, do you speak English? These sorts of things. And so the default understanding is the challenge. And so I wanted to ask Professor Ho, if you'd like to talk about this question of belonging, and then we'll come around back to Congressman Leo and Professor Leo. Oh, I don't know if we've lost. It seems that we may have lost Professor Ho. So let me go belonging.
So thank you. I have grown up in a neighborhood where it just happened that everyone was not Asian. And the school I went to, I was only Chinese American. In fact, most people were white. And it wasn't really until high school that I even had an African-American student in the high school. So my experience growing up was I was made to feel never violent happened to me, but people call me chink. They would, sometimes throw eggs at our house. One day our tires were slashed. So it's sort of these, microaggressions. And I thought, oh, it's really quite different. It is something I think a lot of Asian American kids grow up with, that the notion that they somehow don't belong. Now that is changing. And one reason it's changing is you do see more representation in government, in the media, but also just the sheer population growth is pretty astounding. Right now, more immigrants from Asia to the United States than any other region in the world. And the Pew Research report shows that they project by 2055, Asian Americans will be the largest immigrant group in America. And so I think while time doesn't cure things, time plus population growth will actually, I believe, make things better.
Well, and the population growth also yields greater kinds of things. Thank you for that. Professor Leo, did you want to speak to that? You've recently written an article entitled, I'm Proud to be an American.
Thanks, Clay. American might be a WASP, and if to America, I think particularly for first-generation immigrant like me, is self-created. Or we like to talk about Taiwan, we like to talk about Chinese politics, not American politics. But I think in the last 4 years, not only the population is growing, as many, particularly the Chinese American group, we were forced, as Professor Jun mentioned, had it not been for Asian American votes, I don't think President Biden is going to win Georgia. Had it not been for mobilization of Asian American votes, Senator Raphael Warnock and Senator Joseph Ossoff, first African American senator, first Jewish senator from Georgia, they're not going to happen. I think this process that we're participating in the political process and we're making a difference has created a new sense of belonging. We belong here. I think this is a leap. And I was asked the question yesterday is whether this is going to continue. I think this is going to continue. It will be sustained for many, many years to come.
Thank you for that. We're trying to get Professor Ho back with us. I'm not quite sure what happened on that front, but I wanted to pick up on something that Professor Liu mentioned in his earlier comments. In his earlier comments, he noted that one branch of the US government, the Department of Justice, has something called the China Initiative. The China Initiative is something that we've devoted a lot of time and energy to at the US China Institute. And at our website, you can see links to some of the interviews that we've had with both people charged with carrying it out and people who are critical of it. I would encourage you to take a look at that. But that is an important question. And we have Congressman Liu, who is trained as an attorney, a member of the Judiciary Committee, those sorts of things. How worried should we be that labeling something as the China Initiative in the Department of Justice leads quite quickly, easily, to racial profiling, to discriminatory enforcement, that rather than looking for whatever sort of economic espionage you might find, you start by looking at people of Chinese ancestry in academia and in business. And so since Professor Liu, since you brought that up, I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about it and the role of things like that in perpetuating the question of foreignness, belonging.
Yeah, I would say China Initiative is probably like a modern day Chinese Exclusion Act. That's what it does. And if you listen to FBI Director Christopher Wray, in his open remarks, and recently one professor from MIT, Gang Chen, was charged, the local field director of FBI, basically saying the same thing, is every 10 hours, we open a case against the ethnic Chinese for either stealing intellectual property or engaged in commercial espionage. Every 10 hours from 2 years ago, how many ethnic Chinese or Chinese American researchers, from NIH or other research institutions supported by NIH and National Science Foundation and being charged? How many of them were convicted? We want to know these things. Professor Maggie Lewis of Seton Hall University wrote a long paper about, she didn't say this is malpractice, but this is, as Clay, you mentioned, it is racial profiling. It is perpetrating this stereotype that Chinese Americans have divided loyalty, and they are, every one of them. I think Congressman also mentioned at the State Department, I also heard other people say ethnic Chinese Americans, it's very difficult for them to pass security clearance, largely because, they are Chinese American, they cannot be trusted. And that's serious. While I applaud President Biden and the administration, all the effort, coming down here to Atlanta to talk to AAPI leaders, the Congress administration doing so many things and asking the Justice Department doing all the things, I do urge both Congress and the administration to look at the China initiative. We need to know more, and I think this it's legitimate to catch all the spies, but then to label a task force as being Chinese or perpetrated by the Chinese Americans, that's just wrong. That is not appropriate, and particularly at this time of tragedy and growing violence against Asian Americans.
Thank you. Congressman, would you care to comment on the China initiative, how it's being implemented?
Sure. In the last term of the Obama administration, I remember when I read an article about how Sherry Chen, a federal employee, had been arrested by FBI agents accused of espionage-type crimes. And then essentially many months later, all charges were dropped. So I started to write a letter to the Department of Justice, basically asking what happened. Before I could finish that letter, I read another article, this time about Professor Xi, who was arrested by FBI agents, also charged with espionage-type crimes. And then his case, several months later, also all charges were dropped. And as we looked into this, there were about 4 or 5 cases like this where the only thing that was the same were that defendants were charged with espionage-type cases, then the charges were later dropped, and those defendants all happened to look like me. They happened to be Asian American. And so I worked with other members of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. We did press conferences, wrote op-eds. We also called in members of administration. And we got the Department of Justice to do 2 things. They added another layer of review in the Washington, D.C. office for these kinds of cases so that a U.S. attorney couldn't just go ahead and charge these things without a second layer review. And then the then Attorney General at the time ordered implicit bias training for all personnel at the Department of Justice. And to us, that was a recognition that they understood something was happening where either prosecutors or investigators were holding Asian Americans to a higher level of suspicion. And so they ordered that training. I don't believe the Trump administration ever executed that training. So I'm in the process now of writing a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland, asking him to institute the training that then Attorney General Loretta Lynch had ordered.
Yeah, we definitely need that kind of training. We had an interview with Assistant Attorney General John Demers, and we asked about the kinds of skills, the kinds of competencies that he was trying to recruit for in his job of defending national security. And language training and these sorts of things, cultural sensitivity, not part of that agenda. Rather, there was a focus on technical skills and this sort of thing. So definitely the need. And we've been fortunate to have Professor Xi as a guest to speak about his experiences and the continued trends. If we could shift a little bit here, one of the people in the Q&A makes the point that, in fact, Asian Americans are overrepresented in the U.S. military. That, in fact, in terms of putting on a uniform and defending the rights and interests of all, Asian Americans are out in front ahead of their numbers in population would suggest. I'd like to bring in Professor Jun to talk about the question of service, the question of that kind of engagement. You highlighted getting involved in the school board and things like that. Are we seeing a pipeline of Asian American, Pacific Islander American people who are serving in their local communities who might continue to rise, serve at the county level, serve at the state level, even at the national level?
I think we are. I think that's a very good point. I'm not sure that, I don't know what the research says systematically about military service, but in many ways for national office, military service, particularly for men, is considered a desirable, if not a necessary condition to demonstrate loyalty and patriotism, and particularly so for Asian Americans. But Asian Americans are involved in all kinds of politics at the community level. So it's not just school boards, it's, community organizations, it's town councils, it's 20 years that follows the population dynamics as well. So Representative Liu's district is not an Asian American majority district. I believe it's only about 14% Asian American. It's just got everybody in it, like most districts in the state of California do. And it's often the case, it's one of the most interesting examples, or rather facts about US politics, is Asian Americans are really the only non-white candidates who are able to be elected either statewide or in districts that are not majority minority. And make what you will of that, but most of the time, if in other districts, let's say that are represented by African Americans or Latinx members of Congress, or for that matter, in state governments, people, I'll just give you the example of Bobby Jindal and the South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. These are two Asian Americans, in addition to Gary Locke, who are elected at the state level despite not having even very large Asian American populations. And so I think the line of opening for Asian American elected officials is great. Not only, I'm not saying that there isn't discrimination from voters, but voters think about Asian American candidates in a different way than they do about African American and Latinx candidates. And by that, I mean white voters think about Asian Americans in a different way. So I do think that in many ways, local politics is a training ground for what you're going to see further up the line. And the presence of Asian Americans in all of these elected offices, and just as well as town councils and appointed positions, is important to show everybody that Asian Americans belong in the mix.
So through the magic of that old technology called the telephone, we have Professor Ho back with us. Thank you, Professor Jun, for that, talking about the pipeline, talking about participation, and what is happening. And we lost Professor Ho when we were talking about foreignness, when we were talking about belonging. And Professor Ho, I don't know if you'd like to address that or add other comments.
Yes. So first of all, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So apologies. I was literally saying before we all jumped onto this webinar that I had lost, my neighborhood had lost internet connection 2 days ago when I was in a Zoom meeting, and I had to call in, and I apparently have to do it here too. So I did want to just address the issue of representation, and apologies if this has already been talked about and I wasn't able to hear. I think that representation is, of course, important, but it's not everything. And the reason I bring up that it's not everything is that, first of all, I said yes to this event largely because I was thrilled that Representative Liu was here. I've been following his Twitter account. I believe that he is a voice for justice and for the Asian American Pacific Islander community. I don't know if I would feel the same way if Elaine Chao had been invited. In other words, Elaine Chao being part of the cabinet under the former administration did not make me feel safe as either a Chinese American or an Asian American. Her politics are not my politics. So the fact that we have an Asian American representative in the White House didn't actually translate into anything as far as stopping racism against Asian Americans, or in fact, having the president at the time contribute to that atmosphere of racism against Asian Americans. And so while of course, I want more and better representation of Asian Americans in politics, I want the right kind of Asian American politician that actually cares about ending racism.
Thank you, Professor Ho, for...
Professor Ho, I just want to add something. When the former president started using racist phrases like Kung Flu, I actually tried to contact Secretary Chao. And she ignored me. So just want to put that out there.
I bet you did, and I'm not surprised that she ignored you.
Yeah, the Secretary Chao, of course, found that loyalty was one way. Once she left the cabinet, and then after her husband criticized the president, the president issued some statements about her Chinese business dealings and things like that. So loyalty definitely went one way. Well, we have reached close to the conclusion of our program, but I wanted to allow each of our panelists a chance to raise any concerns that haven't been addressed. Now, we can't in 75 minutes begin to talk about all of these different issues. And in the Q&A, some people have raised questions very, very specific about incidences and also giving examples of how a Chinese boy, when he was called Chinese, he said, "No, I'm from New Jersey." And so, made those kinds of statements. But I'd like to invite each of you to offer some parting words, as it were. And so, Jennifer, since you've struggled so hard to be back with us, why don't you get us started? Just a minute or so.
Absolutely. So I know that some people put in the chat, questioning whether education is really going to solve racism. I think we need education to solve racism. I don't know that education is the only thing, but certainly if we don't know about our history, Asian American history, and how that's interconnected to the histories of other people, then we won't know how to start. The other thing that I'll say is that all of us can choose to be anti-racism educators. It doesn't matter what your identity is. It's really a matter of just choosing that you want to fight against racism.
Now, thank you for that. We all have an obligation. We are in this together. The negative actions, hamper us all. Prejudice is a disability, and it weakens our society. Jane, would you go next? Professor Jun, please.
Yeah, sure. I think that if I would, just want to say something about partisanship. I mean, most Asian Americans who are voters vote Democratic. And yet there are still, a substantial proportion, probably a third, who support Republicans now and then. And that is just the nature of our community. And our community, as someone mentioned earlier, is a very diverse community. We're not uniformly, as African Americans are, mostly behind the Democratic Party. I think it provides an opportunity for political mobilization. And it also requires us to listen to all of our elected officials as well as our fellow voters. I just want to end by asking you to think about the young people, though. The young people who are Asian American, highly educated, for the most part born in the United States, heavily, heavily Democratic and progressive. That's where the future is for Asian American politics.
Demography is destiny. So one of the examples we have in Southern California is a Korean American who serves in Congress, Young Kim, who is a Republican. And so Republicans nominated her, Republicans supported her. And so it's not exclusively a Democrat-Republican issue. And that's something that comes out in the documentary film that I want to encourage people to see again, First Vote, that Professor Ho is part of. You see Chinese Americans for Trump as part of that discussion. But in fact, let's go to Atlanta, where Professor Liu has explained the key role that Asian Americans played in moving the Senate in the Democratic direction.
Yeah, my departing words would be, as U.S. and Chinese rivalry becomes more fierce, our loyalty are going to be questioned more and more. As Chinese immigrants who voluntarily decided, we're going to be Americans, so our loyalty should not be divided at all. There's only one country that we're loyal to, and that is the United States. And that's going to lead to belonging, that's going to lead to political activism. But at the same time, we don't want to see the two relationship get into a zero-sum rivalry or maybe even escalating to conflict. So I always like to refer to our group as a special interest group that we would like to have the two countries peacefully coexist. So we should not be afraid of pointing out to the government that there are better ways to manage this relationship so it doesn't have to go into conflict.
Thank you, Professor Liu, who again focuses on U.S.-China relations, U.S.-China perceptions. Congressman Liu, why don't you be our concluding speaker?
Well, let me thank again the USC U.S.-China Institute for putting on this wonderful event, and Clay for doing such an excellent job of moderating. I thought I'd just leave with some words of hope. The Vice President of the United States is Black and Asian American. For the first time, you had a President of the United States in a primetime speech talk about the Asian American community. And then the President and Vice President of the United States went to Georgia and met with Asian American leaders. You have an executive order from the President of the United States on fighting racism and hate against Asian American community. So you do have some things that probably 50 years ago you would not have seen. In addition, what we do see is this amazing growth in the population of Asian Americans. And then last few weeks, you saw rallies across America in support of the Asian American community. They weren't massive, but they weren't small either. And you had a number of non-Asian Americans turn out in support of the Asian American community. So all of this is good. And I think you're starting to see the political awakening of the Asian American community, and also more recognition by non-Asian Americans of the growing numbers and influence of the Asian American community. So with that, thanks so much again for having me on, and I look forward to working with all of you as we make America a more perfect union.
Thank you. That's a great task for all of us, and you've given us cause for optimism. Thank you all for speaking, sharing your expertise, sharing your experiences with us. We want to say thank you to the audience for joining us. And what we want to do is also to deputize you, to ask you to help spread these messages. When we post the video for this event, we'll send out a link, and you can share that with friends, with family, with colleagues, and others who would benefit from being part of this discussion. It's been a great honor to have our distinguished speakers with us, and I want to thank the folks across USC who helped to spread the word about the event, but especially the team at the USC U.S.-China Institute, Craig Stubing, Catherine Gao, Venus Jones, and others who have made this possible. But now it's down to all of us. We all have a role to play. We all have a stake in addressing bias and the abuse that it generates. Thank you all for being with us.